All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are live. By the way, after you left yesterday, if anybody, I know you don't do this, because you're not so excited you want to take U.S. history class twice in one day, but if you would have gone on YouTube yesterday, you would have been treated to pre-algebra class, activity period. I forgot to end the stream. So this classroom was YouTube live for like 2.5 hours.
I was like, I'm not much of the. I like where you're going.
No, that's not what I wanted to do.
Even if that's not actually in what?
It's called The Great War in the chapter in the book that you don't have, but it's called The Great War. But Mackenzie knows it better as the war to end all wars, because we're coming out. Listen, the first part of this notes, the emphasis here is Wilson kind of is symbolizing, he's the idealist, but he's also symbolizing this idealism that comes from the progressive era. Are you following the history here? Just like math, you can't lose one part of it and continue on because it's all building on itself. History obviously builds on itself too, right? Or left, whatever that's supposed to mean. Why do you have a sticker pointing to the left on your forehead? I don't know. But so history builds on itself. So this idealism is a product of the progressive movement, where all these reforms based on humanism, based on the idea that we can fix everything, right? And Wilson's idea is, America is a great place and the ideal place in the world to live, and we're going to show the whole world how democracy is so great, and we're going to export that, and we're not going to do it with force. So Wilson's going to do everything he can to keep us out of war, because war is unnecessary. If everybody would just realize how democracy works, and we can spread this ideal place we call America to the rest of the world, we'd all trade with each other and there'd be peace and harmony. And that's his idea. That is that reality. We found out that immediately when he comes into office, he's faced with these things right here in our own backyard or our own basement. That somebody might be offended if I said it that way. Two neighbors to our south that there was big problems. We had to settle there in Mexico with Pancho Villa, and then we also had problems in Hispaniola. So his idealism is going to have to give way to realism. What's really going on across the pond? Across the pond, we know that World War I has just ignited on June 28, 1914, with the assassination of this guy. This guy was assassinated by this guy. This guy was a member of this group. Why was this group a group? Because they were a group of people that were rebelling against Austria-Hungary. What is that? I thought Austria was a country and Hungary was a country. Well, they are today, but 100 years ago, it was Austria-Hungary. It was an empire. Remember, this is still a world where imperialism, one of the causes of the war, right? Imperialism was still strong. Countries of Europe who had gone and competed for all these other places in the world that weren't developed yet. And Serbia was being dominated by Austria-Hungary. And there were many Serbians that were living outside of the smaller place they called Serbia, who were Serbians and thought Serbia should not be dominated by Austria-Hungary. Does that all make sense? So they were rebelling against them. And if you remember the story, the Archduke and his wife kind of fell right into the hands of this Prince Seip guy, because they were going to bomb him. That didn't work out. And then they turned down the street that they weren't really supposed to turn down. And he's like, oh, there they are. Bang, bang. And World War I happens. How did World War I happen? It's because of all of these things. Many of the countries, and I need to emphasize that really, some people in history argue this, but Germany was the most prepared. Germany Looking back, people think that World War II happened because all the blame went to Germany back then. So they try to kind of relook at it and say, was Germany really that bad? You can study history outside of class. Remember, that's what we want you to do. Like, hey, wouldn't it be great if you were so interested, you would study this stuff outside of the classroom? So you'll run into maybe in your studies through college, some people theorizing that Germany wasn't such a culprit, but when you look at how things happened, they were obviously the most ready for war, the most militaristic. They already had a plan in place in case war broke out, how they were going to execute the war. It was kind of obvious to me that Germany was most militaristic. The alliances are going to cause a domino effect. Anybody ever play dominoes? You might have played with dominoes. Did you ever play dominoes? When I was a kid, I didn't know there was such thing as a game called dominoes, right? I just dominoes, you put them up, knock them down. That was like fun, right? But so dominoes, one domino goes and then the rest go. That's kind of what's going to happen with World War I. And then, of course, nationalism. So here we go with new notes. The web of war. Why is it called a web? Because you've got all of these alliances and all of these players crisscrossing each other, and it's going to become like a domino effect. Once one country declares war because of the alliances, that's going to cause another country to get involved. And when that country gets involved, that's going to cause another country to get involved because they have a pact with that country, like this. Once Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and remember, by the way, Austria-Hungary and Germany are allies, and Germany was like, hey, you got to do something about this. They assassinated your archduke. What are you going to do? So Germany was kind of urging Austria-Hungary to declare war on Serbia. Yeah. Yes. So if Germany declares war on Serbia, and one of the alliances that isn't up there because they're not considered a major country, but Serbia had a pact, PACT, was kind of an agreement. I say agreement, you say pact. Serbia had a pact with Russia. So when Austria-Hungary declared war on Russia, Russia's like, oh no, you're not going to declare a war on a smaller country, a country that we have good relations with, we have an agreement with, that if someone attacks them, we'll come to their aid. You can't. Yes, ma'am.
Can I interrupt for 1 minute?
Yeah.
And I have to go right back down. I'm reading what I wrote on the board. I wrote hypotonic solution. And I gave you an example of a hypotonic. I should have written hypertonic. Hyper. So just change your notes to say those two pictures that were on the board.
That changes things dramatically.
It does.
That's like negative.
I looked at what I wrote with my next class and I'm like, oh my gosh, I wrote it backwards. So make it hypertonic, what I wrote on the board. Got it? Hyper. My brain. I was blonde. I ain't blonde. I don't know.
Yeah.
Fix it.
Yes, ma'am. So that'll be like negative 80 degrees or 80 degrees, right? Hyper. All right. So where were we? This web developing. Russia feels obligated to come to the aid of Austria-Hungary. Well, they're mobilizing their troops. By the way, did I make it clear yesterday where the Balkans were? The Balkans are this area of the world. Here's Greece, ladies and gentlemen. Macedonia, we've heard about that place, I hope. Northern Greece here. Then you've got places like Bulgaria, Serbia, Bosnia. Those countries might not make sense to you. There was a country that was made out of a bunch of those countries called Yugoslavia. And I think that country broke up before you were even born. It's not kind of old. But this area of the world is called the Balkans. All right. And when Russia starts mobilizing their troops there because Serbia's there, well, what happens? Germany declares war on Russia. Oh, you're going to come to the aid of the Serbians. Okay. Then we'll declare war on you too. Austria-Hungary declared war on the Serbs, which led Russia to move. So Germany, because they are friends with Austria-Hungary, declares war on Russia. Notice how quickly Germany acted, right? Tell me they weren't ready for war. Doesn't it appear Germany kind of wants war? So, what dominoes? Since Germany declares war on Russia, France says, oh no, we have an alliance with Russia. And it's Germany anyways, who we historically don't like. So they start to build their troops up. So what's Germany do? They see Russia or France building up their troops, coming to the aid of Russia. Okay, they declare war on France. Look how fast it's happening. For back then, that's happening pretty quick. 2 days later, they're declaring war on France. The whole quote unquote world, all of Europe's about to erupt into war. Another domino. Germany, because they declared war on France, which was their plan anyways. This isn't world history, but 40 years before this, France and Germany had a pretty significant war. It ended in 1870, Franco-Prussian War. So Germany and France are already at odds. So Germany's going to use this opportunity to go take what they feel like is theirs anyway, and they can't wait to crush the French anyway. So now that this war started, let's get it going. And actually, Germany's got a plan. One of their military leaders named Schlieffen already has a plan. He thinks he's just going to roll into France, take out Paris, might take a couple weeks. Once he gets France under control, he's going to focus his attention on Russia. No problem. Germans, we got this. We're ready to go. Kind of crazy, huh? Doesn't work out that way. But he wants to use Belgium as a base. So he wants to go, instead of going directly into France from Germany, he wants to come from the north, right? So he wants to go through Belgium. There's a problem, though. Belgium is friends with, here comes another domino, Great Britain. Great Britain has kind of, it's like Belgium's big brother in all this. Belgium wants to stay neutral. They're not a powerful military, but Great Britain obviously is, right, all these years. So when Germany wants to use Belgium, they ask them. Belgium says, no, you're not going to use us as a launching pad to invade France. And Germany says, yes, we are. And Great Britain says, no, they're not giving you permission. So Great Britain sends troops into Belgium to try to stop the Germans from going through Belgium. So now you got the British and the Belgians trying to stop the Germans from going into France, but the Germans are like, we're going anyway. So think about this. If Germany wasn't ready for this or didn't want this, in a span of what, a week, they've elected to go to war against three pretty powerful countries: France, Russia, and United Kingdom, Great Britain. So they ignore the British and they invade Belgium, and the Belgians and the Brits try to keep them away. But again, General Schlieffen says, hey, no fear, people. It's August, but you'll be home before the leaves fall from the trees. This was how optimistic he was. This was how ready Germany was for war. Even if the leaves fell late like this year. Last week at this time, I looked at my tree. Well, maybe it was last Wednesday. I was like, man. And then Thursday came and got that really cold that one morning. And then that next day I come home and they're almost all off. But anyway, it was pretty late. Did anybody else notice that? How late the leaves changed and came down this year? Well, even so, the plan was this is all going to be done, at least on the Western Front, at least as far as France goes. We'll have Paris, and you troops that we're sending to France, you'll be home in months at the most. So Great Britain declares war on Germany for invading Belgium. So German soldiers are going through Belgium. They get into France. They continue on. They're being very successful. The Belgians and the British, once they get into France, are trying to help the French to keep them back. The Germans keep making progress until finally they're stopped. They don't quite make it to Paris. Oh, by the way, there's a big difference in outlook, right? You got the very optimistic Germans under Schlieffen's plan that we're going to take out Paris and then focus on Russia, and this is all going to be over very quickly. Then you've got the other side of the coin. The Great Britain, Lord Grey was his name, he looks at the situation and says, uh-oh, I fear something very gloomy ahead. The lights are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime. Two extremes, right? One side thought this is going to be over like that. The other side, at least Lord Grey, at least from the British perspective, they thought once this started, the whole continent's going to be at war. Who knows? Who knows how long? Might go on for decades. By the end of August, the Germans were just outside of Paris. Until they were finally stopped. And maybe you remember from 5th grade or from Mr. Lamb that World War I is known for what kind of warfare? Trench warfare. What does that mean? That means once the Germans were stopped just outside of Paris, and they knew they couldn't continue on because the resistance finally built up between the French, the Belgians, and the English, and they stopped them. Okay, so the Germans took a break. They built some trenches. Well, so did the French and the Brits. Well, they built these trenches for refuge, so they would pause and then they would strategize and try to come up with another attack plan. Well, what's going to happen over the next year, because now it's going to turn into 1915, is the troops on both sides are going to be in these trenches that go on for hundreds of miles on both sides. And very few attacks were going to happen. So for a year, at least, it's going to be called a deadlock. Neither side, the Allies, the French and the British and the Russians, nor the Central Powers, which we first called the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, neither side's going to be winning. It's going to be a lot of this. Sleepless nights in trenches. Think of this. What would be more mentally taxing? Not physically, mentally. If you're a soldier and that's your job, and you're out there every day, you're on the battlefield, today we're going to be moving from this area 5 miles, we're going to move to that area, we're going to be attacking this place next week. So you're constantly in motion, right? You don't have time to sit around and think about what you're doing. You're constantly moving, right? What about if you're sitting in a trench for weeks, months, and every night you're like, you don't know if the other side's going to try to attack. Wouldn't that be awful? There was a lot of things written. People writing diaries and poems about how life was like for the soldiers. You might think, oh, that was easy. We're just sitting in the trench and nobody's out there getting killed. Well, guess what? Is it easy? Because if you're out there doing it, you're not thinking about it all the time. You're just doing your job. So every once in a while, one side would decide, okay, we got a plan. We're going to attack the other side. And the way the trenches were set up, you're underground, right? So when someone's trying to attack, you could see them. They can't see you. They've got things called parapets, which are like sandbags and barbed wire all across the top of the trench so that they can be protected. So whenever one side would try to attack, most of the time they'd be shot down before they got there. So what did they call the land between the trenches? Anybody remember?
No man's land.
No man's land. Because there were such few and far between attacks because all you see is dead bodies in between. Make sense? And again, mentally, how would that be? Oh, add to the mental stress of like you're just sitting there not knowing when you're going to be attacked again. Think about when it rains. Think about sanitation. if you got dozens or hundreds of soldiers within a small area in a trench, everybody's got to go to the restroom every day, right? Yikes. You got rats, when it rains and fills up with water. Oh, it'd be awful, wouldn't it? Winter, we're gonna be heading to winter. Anybody remember the Christmas truce from 5th grade? Anybody remember that story of how they came up out of their trenches and they started singing Christmas carols together? Wasn't that freaky? That's at the beginning of the war in 1914. That they're sitting there in their trenches all this time going crazy probably. And both sides kind of like wanting to decorate, get joyous for Christmas. And they end up coming out of the trenches and playing soccer. You got German soldiers against French and British soldiers playing soccer against each other in the middle of a war, singing Christmas carols. Called the Christmas Truce in 1914. Well, here's what it looks like. You got that, of course, the huge country, Russia, them, France, Great Britain, part of in the beginning, it's called the Triple Entente. It's going to be later, we're going to refer to them as starts with an A, the Allies. The good guys are the Allies. So you got Russia, France, and Great Britain, called the Allies. The Triple Alliance, who now I'm going to refer to them as the Central Powers. In World War II, they're going to be the Axis powers. They're in brown. That's Germany, Austria-Hungary. Again, here's Serbia, but there's people living down here in southern Austria-Hungary Empire. By the way, see that word there, Croats? Have you ever heard of a place called Croatia? Okay, so you got that nationality. You've got the Serbs. There's the city where the assassination took place, Sarajevo. Slovenians. So you got all these people, and the Serbians are like, we're tired of Austria-Hungary dominating and dictating things to us. And you've got Serbians that live outside of this area that's been bordered Serbia that think Serbia should be larger. And that's where the rebellion was taking place. By the way, this is Turkey, and the Ottomans had an empire as well. So this would be just the countries of Europe at World War I. Notice that there's no, Germany's not defined like it is today. They've got their own little, kind of bigger piece of Europe. What's that? What's that country? Ever heard of that country? That's not a country, is it? Galicia? No. Look how huge Hungary is. This is Austria and Hungary combined. Questions? Another major country that's neutral in the war is Spain. Notice we haven't heard much from Spain lately, have we? Spain, so dominant in the early years of exploration, even in our part of the world. Okay, so this war breaks out over in Europe. America's 3,000 miles away. Jonathan, why should we be concerned, or why should we get involved? We're way over here. We shouldn't mess with what's going on over there, should we? Like, should we send our soldiers to go fight in their war? Doesn't make any sense, does it? Shouldn't we just stay out of it? Maybe you're confused because you know that we don't stay out of it, huh? You know the end of the story. There's spoiler alert. You know that we're actually going to be in the war. But there's a strong sentiment in America that we should not get involved in that war. We should stay out of it. We've got trading partners. We got good relations, very good relations with England and with France. We got good relations with Germany. We get along. We have trading partners. Our economy is going to be affected by this war, but we don't want to choose sides. We kind of want to hey, could you guys resolve that so we can just continue with our prosperity? So we really don't want to send our troops there. And almost all Americans feel that way. So how are we going to stay out of it, though? Riley already knows. Obviously, we get in it at some point, right? But we do everything we can, basically, to not get into it and stay neutral. Oh, and by the way, speaking of history building on itself, 100 years before this, what did Monroe say? We'll take care of this part of the world, Europe. You take care of your part of the world. Remember that Monroe Doctrine? And then Roosevelt followed it up just 10 years before this and said, well, we're like the policemen of this part of the world. So, hey, Europe, we got problems over here. You got problems over here. We'll take care of it. So we already established this idea that we'll do our thing and you do your thing. We'll develop this great relationship with trade. We talked about Wilson's idealism that as we continue to trade with you, some of you countries over there in Europe that haven't caught on to this whole democracy thing, maybe you'll catch on. The world will be a better place. So we want to be friendly with all of them. But is that even possible? Is that going to be possible? Obviously not. Things are going to change. Now, if you were to take a poll, people take polls all the time now, right? 38% of people think the president's doing a good job. 28% of people think the vice president's doing a good job. Polls like that. So if you were to take a poll back then, you would have found that most Americans, if they had to choose a side, probably would have chosen the Allies, Great Britain, France, because most of our heritage is connected to England, right? Our roots, the roots of American heritage are connected directly to Great Britain. And we share the culture, the language. But we do have, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, most of the immigrants that came to America were from like Ireland or Germany. Germany's one of the main actors in this war. So if you're a recent immigrant from Germany, that means you've got parents or grandparents living in Germany, true? Who are you going to want to win? In your own personal little world, you're probably going to want Germany to prevail. You got family there still. Plus the Irish. You might assume, because Ireland's right here next to Great Britain, that Ireland and Great Britain are like together. No, they're not. Ireland is its own separate country, in fact, very hostile towards the English. Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. Ireland itself is its own entity and has a lot of historical hostility with the United Kingdom. Northern Ireland's part of the United Kingdom. A lot of it has to do with religion, frankly. Ireland itself proper is Catholic. Northern Ireland is Protestant. And of course, England's Protestant. So Northern Ireland, okay, if you haven't learned this before, we refer to this place in the world, sometimes you just say England, right? You heard people just refer to it as England. England's only one nation on that island. You've got England, you got Wales, you got Scotland. You with me? So that's Great Britain. But then if you take that island where England is, Great Britain, and you add Northern Ireland, now you've got the United Kingdom. You understand all that? So sometimes people will just say England and they mean Great Britain. Sometimes they'll say Great Britain and they mean all the United Kingdom. So from now on in your life, when you hear somebody say United Kingdom, they're talking about everything, right? They're all consolidated into one kingdom. Scotland, England, Wales. Make sense? And what about the French? I mean, it's been 140 years, but there's a lot of people in America that learned history, and they know that there wouldn't even be America without the French. Right? How'd we win the revolution? Would we have won the revolution without France? So some guy wrote a poem. And the last line of the poem says, the poem's called The Sword of Lafayette. And the last line of the poem says, forget us, God, if we forget the sacred sword of Lafayette. What's that mean? That's sharing the American sentiment that if France needs us, don't we have to go aid them in this war across the pond, even though we don't want to get involved? I mean, don't we owe a debt to France? You got Lafayette, the leader that came to help General Washington, and he got the fact that it took their navy to come up the coast that helped Washington box them in to defeat the British. So we owe the French. So this is going on in America. There's a divide, but most Americans will favor the Allies. And then there's this. And I have a question mark next to it because some people would claim, oh, the Americans just wanted the Allies to win because they were getting a bunch of propaganda. Anti-German propaganda, because who was controlling the information? By the way, does anybody know how we got information back then? They didn't have these. They didn't have these. By this time, I would say it would still take at least a week to go across. Well, let's see. When did the Titanic leave? Titanic sank overnight, April 14th to 15th. I think it left Ireland April, maybe a week. What's that? It was in 1912, but I can't remember how many days it took for the Titanic to get across the pond there. Yeah.
Interesting.
Sure. So anyway, it would still take several days at least, right? So how are we getting information? Telegram, but how was that happening? We weren't in a digital world. The transatlantic, you know what I'm talking about? They had laid a cable, transatlantic cable was laid to connect the North America and Great Britain. And Great Britain had control of that. So they were controlling all the information. So the information that was coming to America in the form of news was all being filtered through Great Britain's perspective. So some people were like, if you were pro-German, you'd be like, oh, you're just listening to the propaganda because that's all filtered by Great Britain. The U.S. trade, okay, again, how can America stay neutral when this war is really going to affect us economically? Our American producers rely on selling things to the people in Europe. How are we going to keep these trade lines open? Oh, by the way, Great Britain has a naval blockade. They're trying to strangle Germany's trade by keeping things going into Europe so that the Germans can get them. And even though we're friendly with Great Britain, they want to make sure that we're not getting anything that's going to help Germany beat them in war. So they've got a blockade, not just us, anyone. They got a blockade set up on the western part of Europe, so nothing can get to Germany from there. So that allows American companies to continue to try, like there's a blockade set up, but if you're going to trade with Great Britain, if your ship's coming from America and it's going to dock in Great Britain or closer to France, well then yeah, come on in. Make sense? So we're going to continue to trade with the Allies. In fact, the Allies need money to continue the war. They need money to buy the products from us because all of their efforts are going to the war, right? So even when it comes to food, if most of their efforts are going to win the war, they're going to rely on the American farmers even to provide food. We're going to be shipping things to help them actually win the war. We're going to be shipping food, right? So this is going to maybe sound weird to you, but this kind of shows you where America was leaning. We loaned money to France and Great Britain so they could buy our stuff. Does that sound weird? Like, wait, you're buying our stuff with our money. Right. But remember, when you loan people money, what do you get on the other side? What's that I word? Interest, right? And that's expected and known. So the idea is we'll loan you the money. We're like selling you the stuff and you're buying it with our money, which sounds weird. But in the end, we're going to end up benefiting from this also because when they pay us back, we're going to get more money. Does that make sense? So let me guess. Germany's just going to sit there and take it. No. Germany's not gonna, just sit by and say, oh, guess there's nothing we can do about it. England's got this blockade set up, so our economy's gonna get crushed as well. No. Germany says, you wanna set up a blockade so ships can't get through? Okay. We'll go under the ships. We'll develop our submarines with torpedoes, and if you don't stop what you're doing, we'll just blow your ship out of the water. And they warned the United States. They said, and other countries. Germany sent out the message. We are considering the waters around Great Britain to be a war zone. If you send your ships into those waters, your ship is free game. We're declaring it a war zone. And if you send your ships in there, you're putting your ships at risk. So now America's got to make a decision. So, the video tomorrow on the sinking of the Lusitania.
Stop the video.
Yes.
Not